The story we usually get about the Civil War is pretty straightforward, right? It's brother against brother, a war fought and won by white soldiers to hold the nation together. But that story, it's missing a huge piece of the puzzle. What if I told you that the war was actually won by the very people it was all about? In this explainer, we're going to unpack a powerful argument that Black Americans weren't just passive recipients of freedom, they were actually the decisive force that won the war.
To really get this, we have to go back to 1862, and things were not going well for the Union. I mean, it was a total disaster. Casualties were through the roof, morale was at rock bottom, and abolitionists like Wendell Phillips were absolutely livid. He said the North was pouring out blood and money like water and getting nothing for it. The pressure on President Lincoln was getting intense.
Let's be really clear here. The Union was losing the war. All the strategies, all the top generals, the entire industrial might of the North, none of it was working. The Confederacy, which was built on the backs of 4 million enslaved people, was just way more resilient than anybody thought. Something radical had to happen, and it had to happen fast.
And right at the heart of this whole crisis was Abraham Lincoln's massive dilemma. You see, he was fighting one war, but a whole lot of people were demanding he fight a completely different one. And this slide just lays it out perfectly. On one side, you've got Lincoln. His #1 paramount goal was just to save the Union. He even said, and this is a famous quote, that if he could do it without freeing a single slave, he would. But on the other side, you have the abolitionists. For them, this was a moral crusade. What's the point of saving the Union if you don't destroy slavery in the process? This wasn't just some polite debate, It was a political firestorm that was threatening to tear the North apart from the inside.
And Lincoln's fear here, it wasn't just some abstract idea. It was super practical. He was terrified of losing the border states. These are the slave states like Kentucky that actually stayed loyal to the Union. He was convinced that any move toward emancipation would just push them right into the arms of the Confederacy. As he put it, those 20,000 Union muskets in Kentucky would be thrown down, or, even worse, carried over to the enemy.
So, the war's going terribly. His political options are a mess. What on earth could force a leader as cautious as Lincoln to do a complete 180 degrees? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It was sheer necessity.
So what was it? If making the war about slavery was so politically dangerous, what forced his hand? Well, it wasn't some sudden moral epiphany. It was actually a perfect storm of 3 huge pressures that made emancipation a military necessity.
First, and this is so important, enslaved people themselves were forcing the issue. They weren't just waiting around to be freed, they were freeing themselves, running to Union Army lines by the thousands. This fugitive tide was a massive blow to the Southern economy. Second, the North was bleeding, and it desperately needed a better reason to keep fighting. Saving the Union just wasn't cutting it anymore to justify the horrific death tolls. And third, the international clock was ticking. England and France were this close to recognizing the Confederacy, which would have been a game-over moment for the Union.
And so, on New Year's Day, 1863, Lincoln finally made his move. But the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't really this grand moral document. It was a weapon of war. It was laser-focused, only targeting the states in rebellion. The goal? Cripple their economy and, maybe most importantly, officially open the door for Black men to pick up a gun and fight for the Union.
And the reaction? Oh, it was not a celebration. Not at all. In the South, it was met with total contempt. One newspaper in Charleston joked it was like the Pope issuing an order against a comet, completely powerless. But the backlash in the North was just as bad. Lincoln's own party lost seats in the elections, and a lot of people were furious. This was not a popular decision.
But one of the proclamation's biggest and most immediate effects wasn't felt in America at all. It happened across the Atlantic, on the world stage.
You see, the British ruling class, the elites, were pretty cozy with the Confederacy. They kind of saw the Southern plantation owners as their aristocratic cousins. They looked at the war with this cynical attitude. The famous writer Thomas Carlyle just dismissed it as a bunch of people cutting each other's throats over different ways of hiring labor. With that kind of thinking in power, it really looked like Britain was going to step in.
But the working people of England saw things completely differently. In factory towns like Manchester, workers were starving. The Union blockade of the South meant no cotton for their mills. It was called the Cotton Famine, and it cost them their jobs. And yet, in this incredible act of solidarity, they held huge rallies supporting the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation had changed everything for them. Now it was clearly a fight against slavery, and they were on the side of the enslaved.
This wave of support from everyday people was just overwhelming. It made it politically impossible for the British government to officially side with a nation built on slavery. And just like that, the threat of European intervention, the thing that kept Lincoln up at night, it just vanished. It was a massive diplomatic win for the Union.
Okay, so with the diplomatic front now secure, the entire war basically boiled down to one last crucial question. And it's a question that's just dripping with the racism of the time, but it really held the key to everything. Would black men actually fight?
Well, the answer came fast, and it was decisive. 1863 was the year of proof. At Port Hudson, black regiments charged fortified Confederate positions 6 times. At Milliken's Bend, they fought in brutal hand-to-hand combat. And then, in July, came the most legendary test of all.
This was the assault on Fort Wagner, down in South Carolina, and leading the charge was the 54th Massachusetts, one of the very first all-black regiments from the North. You have to understand, for these men, this wasn't just another battle. This was their chance to prove their courage, their manhood, and their right to be called American citizens, right there in the crucible of war.
The assault was essentially a suicide mission. As the 54th charged across the beach, the fort just exploded in a wall of fire. The description is just chilling. Shot shells of iron and bullets crushed through the dense masses. Men were literally being torn to pieces. But they didn't break. They kept going, reached the walls, and fought on top of the ramparts before they were finally overwhelmed.
The assault itself failed, but the raw courage of the 54th became an instant legend. When the Union Army asked for the body of their white colonel, Robert Gould Shaw, the Confederate commander's reply was meant to be the ultimate insult. "We have buried him with his niggers." But Shaw's family responded by saying that was the greatest honor he could have, proof that he died for his men and with his men, united in one cause.
And if you want to see the real impact of the black soldier, look no further than this. In 1862, the official Confederate policy was to execute any white officer captured leading black troops. But by 1865, with their armies just collapsing, who is it pleading with the Confederate government to do the unthinkable? General Robert E. Lee himself, begging them to arm enslaved men to fight for the South. It was a total ideological surrender, forced by the undeniable reality on the battlefield. The final number, it's just staggering. Almost 200,000 black men served in the Union Army. Lincoln himself said later that victory would have been impossible without them. For him, the math was simple. You take those soldiers away from our side and give them to the enemy, and the war is over in 3 weeks. We would have lost.
So the war was won. The Union was saved. But for 4 million people, this was not just a military victory. This was something almost biblical.
The great W.E.B. Du Bois described it not as a political event, but as a spiritual one, an apocalypse, the end of an entire world and the violent, tear-filled, joyful birth of a new one. It was a moment where all the prophecies and all the prayers suddenly seemed to be coming true.
In his second inaugural address, just weeks before he was assassinated, Lincoln offered this chilling, final judgment. He basically suggests that maybe the absolute horror of the war was God's will, a kind of divine payback for the sin of slavery. Every bit of wealth piled up through unpaid labor, every drop of blood drawn with a whip, all of it being paid for, drop for drop, with blood drawn by the sword. It's a profound thought to leave us with, isn't it? What is the true price of justice, and who, in the end, is asked to pay?